Now, in the first video about the afterlife, I talked mainly about the Egyptian concept of the afterlife. Byron's book talks about the descent into the underworld, but I'm going to devote actually a 2-week module to that later in the semester. And I decided to group the afterlife with creation so we can kind of go from the end, or from the beginning to the end, and save the dying and resurrected deity and the descent into the underworld for its own subject. Now, one of the reasons why I talked so long about Egypt was because Egypt sets many of the prototypes that come in later myths. Sumeria does as well. And when we get into the module on the dying and resurrected deity, we will talk about or examine the descent of Inanna and the descent of Ishtar, which are two poems that are concurrent with Sumerian society. I wanted to talk about some of the generalities of the afterlife, especially those that were set in Egypt, or came from Egypt, set in Egypt, I guess you could say. Now, I am going to dwell mainly on the ones that I know very well, and then you're going to have an assignment that perhaps you can educate me a little bit more in other myths from different cultures about the afterlife. And one of the most familiar that I am going to go into is, or might be familiar to you, is the Greek afterlife. Now, as I have stated before somewhere, and probably stated more than once, when you begin to read these myths, you will find that there are many variants to them. And the ancients didn't have a problem with that. The concept of the Greek afterlife is one, I shouldn't say concept, because there are many different concepts. And so when you read these different myths, as with their creationists, you will find variances in what the underworld, the afterlife of the Greeks is supposed to be like. And again, I want to emphasize that with Egypt, their afterlife was not an underworld. In the Greek afterlife, you descend into the center of the earth. In Sumerian afterlife, their afterlife, the place where they go, was called Kur. You descend into the middle of the earth. And even early Christianity, well, for quite some time actually, believed that hell was in the center of the earth. In Norse mythology, Hel, Helheim, from which Christianity gets its name for hell, is also located in the center of the earth. The Egyptian afterlife was not. It was somewhere in the nebulous west. That's where the sun dies, and I'm sure that I mentioned that in the first video, but it's been a couple of weeks since I made it, so I'm rambling. Let's go on. Greek myth and the concept of the afterlife. First of all, the original Greek afterlife was ruled over by Hecate and probably Persephone as part of a triad. And even with Hecate, we know her as the crone, but in very early either Greek and Pelasgian myth, she was actually the maiden, but that's too much for you to remember, so I'm not going to talk on that extensively. But the afterlife, and notice I'm very carefully not calling it Hades, was ruled over by women. We also see this in Sumeria, where the goddess of the underworld was Ereshkigal. We see it in Norse myth, where the goddess of the underworld was Hel. Boy, I almost blew that one. Was Hel. And even in Egyptian myth, even though Osiris was the god of the underworld, and he replaced Anubis, the jackal-headed god, goddesses were also associated with the underworld, in that the heart of the deceased was weighed against the feather of Maat, a goddess. But in the Greek world, when the Aryans conquered the Pelasgians, Hades became the ruler of the underworld. And he became the ruler of the underworld because he, Poseidon, and Zeus cast lots to see which province they would get. And Hades got the underworld, and it came to be called Hades after him. Now, according to which myth you read, Hades was divided into 3 or 4 parts. There was Tartarus, that originally was created by Zeus to put the Titans, who fought against him. It was a place to imprison them. There were the Asphodel fields, where the commoners went. That's where you and I would go. And then there were the Elysian fields, where the very brave and possibly the very beautiful, those people who are really notable went. And then there were the Isles of the Blessed. The Greeks had a concept of reincarnation, and if you died and if you were reincarnated and died 3 times and made it to Elysium every time, you got to go over to the Isles of the Blessed, where you got to live forever, and you didn't ever have to be reincarnated again. So those were the 3 or 4. Some people leave out the Isles of the Blessed, levels of Hades in the underworld. Now, the underworld, the Greek underworld, was surrounded by 5 rivers, the most notable of which was the Styx. There was the Acheron and Lethe. The river Lethe would, if you drank from it, it would make you forget, and so the shades would often, the ghost, the dead people, would often drink for them so they wouldn't remember what it was like up above, because it was just no fun on the Asphodel fields. Now, the people in Tartarus, they would not have been allowed to drink from the Lethe in order to forget. But you were rowed across the river Styx by the boatman Charon. Now, this is interesting because it goes directly back to Egyptian myth, where Ra sailed his solar barge across the sky and entered Tuat/Duat, whichever pronunciation you prefer. And then he would sail through the 12 levels of Tuat, which represented the 12 hours of the night. Charon is a direct descendant of Ra and his barge, conducting the souls of the dead into the afterlife. Now, some myths have Ra conducting the dead, and some don't. Anubis would conduct them. There's different myths about that. But this concept of the ferryman and the barge or the ferry, definitely a connection to the Greek myth. Sumeria didn't have that. You don't see it always in other myths. Now, in Norse myth, before Ragnarok, which is the destruction of the gods, occurs, the dead set forth from Helheim, which is also called Niflheim, on a boat. So you have to the field where Ragnarok was going to be fought. So you have the concept of the boat. The people crossing the river Styx, they would put a coin, the family would put a coin underneath the tongue in order to pay the ferryman, and we still call that, you have to pay the ferryman a due. It's a cliche. If the dead didn't have that coin, they weren't ferried across the Styx, and they were just kind of wandering around forever there on the banks of the river. I'm not quite sure how that differs from wandering around in the asphodel fields. Maybe it's the reincarnation factor. Never read where that has really been explained. Dogs. Anubis, the jackal-headed god, was originally the god of the dead. When Osiris died and was resurrected, but still had to go live in the dead in order to keep the balance of the universe, Anubis gave his title over to Osiris because Osiris was a little higher up on the echelon. Anubis, though, the most logical reason why I have seen why Anubis, the jackal, was associated with the dead was that jackals would hang around where dead people were buried, and were known for digging them up, and that's all I'm going to say about that. Dogs are also very faithful, and we even hear into modern times about dogs that sleep on the graves of their masters, and I've never heard of their mistresses, but at least for their masters, and so they're also connected with fidelity and loyalty. This concept of the dogs and the dead carries over into Greek myth because, of course, you have Cerberus, the 3-headed dog, who guards the entrance of the underworld. And it's not necessarily to keep people from going in, but to get anybody from going out. In some myths, Cerberus has 3 heads, and others, he has as many as 50 heads, but 3 has become the more accepted. In Norse myth, you also have a dog who guards the entrance to Helheim, and that is Garm. And so that concept of the dog continues on through Greek myth into Norse myth. we still associate hounds with dogs with the dead. And I said hounds because I was thinking about the pack of black hounds that would run with, not Persephone, Hecate. And Hecate being associated with the dead, she would run through the Greek countryside with the ghost of suicides and her pack of black hounds. And then later in Celtic myth, even though this isn't quite substantiated, but Shakespeare speaks about it, you have Herne the Hunter, who also collects the souls of the dead and has a pack of black hounds running with him. So those are some commonalities, some archetypal associations between Egypt and Greece and in Norse myth. In Sumeria, boy, the Sumerian view of the afterlife is just a whole, it's very, very bad. And it changed as time went by, as myths do happen to change. In the earliest versions we have of Gilgamesh, when Gilgamesh talks to his friend Enkidu, after Enkidu has been sent down into Kher, Enkidu says, it's horrible down here. The dead eat clay and drink dust. They crawl around on their stomachs. And this scares Gilgamesh so much that he goes on his quest, which we're also going to talk about later, for immortality. In later versions, some people are punished in Kher and some people are rewarded. Interestingly enough, it's not always according to your deeds why you are sad in Kher or why you're happy in Kher. For example, if you had a lot of kids, especially sons, you were going to be rewarded in Kher. But the woman who does not have children sits in a corner and she cries. In other instances, for example, if a man had been attacked by a lion, he felt that lion chewing on him in the afterlife and other types of things as well. Oh, and if a man did not have children, he too would be unhappy in the afterlife. And so it was kind of like a continuation of whatever your status was when you died. Judaism, their concept of the afterlife changed from the early Hebrew scriptures until the later Hebrew scriptures, and it was probably very much influenced by Zoroastrianism when the Jews were took as captive in Babylon for 40 years, because they went from saying the dead know nothing into talking about the dead being sensate after they're dead. So there's a change in that as well. And then we segue into Christianity. The Christian concept of both heaven and hell are largely based on the Greek concept of hell. Now, Christianity was very much influenced by Platoism, by Plato, Platonic theory. Is Platoism even a word? In that Plato said, perfection existed in the universe, and we see this in heaven. This is a perfect place. The concept of eternal torture comes from the concept of Tartarus in Greek mythology. So we see these carry on into Christianity. Now, in Mayan myth, you have the divine twins who go into the underworld. But they have the concept of Shibaba, and I think I've been saying it wrong. I think I've been saying Zibaba, and I was watching a video the other day, one I posted for you about creation, and they said Shibaba. And that is a multi-layered concept of the universe and even a world tree. I'm going to stop there. I hit some of the highlights of some of the commonalities of the Greek, Egyptian, and the Norse myths in particular. Norse and Greek have other components that are very, very similar. But I'm going to stop there because you're going to have an assignment about the afterlife. And so I'm going to leave some things open for you.